I'm entrusted with a 5-minute introduction, and I'm not sure how long it's going to take me to say certain things, so I'm going to keep some of my comments about what I find David's moving effect on the environment at U of Chicago for the end, when I'll glance at my watch and see if I can tell you about that. But what I want to do for sure is talk to you about something I've never felt so strongly, as strongly with any other human being, which I'll call the of course phenomenon. It's not that David Tracy uses the word of course a lot in a very mannered way and just sort of makes a verbal habit out of those words. It's rather a resounding non-verbal event, a poised benevolence, an unobtrusive force of openness and humble perceptive attention, an incisive ambiguity, a deft orchestration of plurality. And so David says, without having to say, of course Hinduism has illuminations to offer. So when he's asked to participate in a Buddhist Hindu conference, he says yes. Of course, Buddhism is a precursor and successor to the contemporary flirtation with the void in Western thought. So he goes where Buddhists are seeking an eminent Christian to chat with. Of course, he is grateful to learn from the Taoists, the Native Americans, the Sufis, the Jews, the Confucians. When I approached him as a graduate student with my quirky dissertation proposal at U of Chicago, which was to talk about Nietzsche and several phenomenological philosophers and compare them with a wild man mystic from 19th century India named Sri Ramakrishna and a yogi sage named Aurobindo and a janitorial supply salesman named George Simon. He said, of course, Nietzsche, the most influential atheist of recent centuries, has invigorating and purifying effects he could offer to the best and sturdiest ethical and religious thought. Of course, the mystics beckon with messages that can benefit those who must finesse the solidities of earth. And of course, the earthbound can help the mystics navigate their flight if they will stop their soaring for a timeless moment to listen. And of course, a man who peddled vacuum cleaners instead of scholarly tomes while he was alive deserves a chance to stand with dignity amongst these luminaries. Of course, the profound human event is at work in your honest stammering and as yet poorly articulated insights. Of course, the Taoist recluse and the postmodernist scholar, the quiet immobility of the Buddhist meditator and the restive scholarly adventures of ironists and cynics can learn from one another. And of course, this symposium of complementary truth-saying, spanning epochs and regions, does not displace the momentous hints offered by relativism and historicism. I think I can squeeze in 2 more of courses before I yield the floor. Of course, the simple, self-evident rightness of this openness must brave labyrinthine complexities and qualifications, or it will cease to be itself. And of course, I can't read what I write, so I'm going to just tell it to you. Of course, all this medley of affirmations is not a pretext for avoiding moral imperatives, for standing for something, for gathering it together in new sonorities, the fragments that will come together in a music that David learns from T.S. Eliot and others about can't be forced to cohere too facilely or glibly. Of course, what you're finally affirming is not only what it is in itself, but what it can become. So it's an openness of a very uncanny sort of power. And of course, I've talked a good 5 minutes, so I'm not going to tell you about the wonderful effect he had on students and professors at U of Chicago. I'm honored to welcome David Tracy.
I'm deeply grateful to my friend and in many ways mentor on issues we have in common, Marty Cohen, for that extraordinary introduction. Thank you. And I'm always very happy to be, I can almost say, back at Boston College, my sort of academic home away from my home. And because it's such an extraordinary place, both in terms of its students, some of whom I've come to know, who come on to Chicago, and its faculty, many of whom I've been honored to know over the many, many years in some cases, and very recently, like Paul today and others. What I would like to talk about is something I've wanted to force myself to talk about for many years, so be patient if it isn't as sharp as I'd like it. I teach, as you may know, as a theologian and a philosopher of religion in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, but I also teach in this Committee on Social Thought, which is a group of different, Marty was part of it, different professors from different disciplines, who, Saul Bellow, who was a part of it, used to call it Le Salon de la Fusée. And we've always been very happy arguing together over many years. And one of my 5 courses a year for the last 15 or so years, maybe longer, I taught with my late colleague and beloved friend David Green, the great translator of the Greek tragedies. We would take one of the Greek tragedies each year, and the agreement was I would do, which I hadn't done before, though I always loved them, as long as every other year we could do another of Plato's dialogues, which I know more about. And then did Shakespeare, and then did some modern tragedies. And as a philosopher and theologian, I have always been extremely interested in the debates, especially since the 19th century in German philosophy, on tragedy and the relationship to philosophy and theology. I consider it one of the most significant debates in the modern period. So that's what I would like to talk about, but I'm going to watch my time. The title, I don't know what title you originally got from me in my madness, but the actual title of this is Tragic Vision, not the genre of tragedy, but the tragic vision, the abandoned vision of the West, ? And the question is Nietzsche's question and Simone Weil's question, the two I'll be speaking of principally. Namely, for Nietzsche, as you know famously, in The Birth of Tragedy, he maintained that the tragic vision of the Greeks, he meant Aeschylus and Sophocles, he didn't like Euripides, was the greatest vision that the West had produced in terms of understanding suffering and joy and ability to say in the midst of that what he loved to call a yes, not a no to life in all its complexity. And he thought it had been undone principally by 2 forces. First, what he called the optimism of reason, of philosophy as it emerged in Socrates and Plato's reading of Socrates, And what he also thought with Judaism and Christianity was a kind of resentment of the tragic vision. And he thought it was terribly necessary for modern Western culture to recover that vision. Spent a great deal of his life trying to, even later in life. The debate somewhat happened later. I'd love to put him with Simone Weil, because she too thought that Western culture had foolishly let go or abandoned the tragic vision at the heart of the culture. But unlike Nietzsche, and I'm much more with her on this, she did not think Plato had abandoned it at all, especially in the Timaeus, which has deep resonances to Aeschylus. And she certainly did not think that Christianity had, especially in the Gospel of Mark, and in other moments of Christianity like John of the Cross or Pascal, many others. I agree with her on both of those, but I agree with both Nietzsche and Weil on the import for all of us, no matter what our other position, not to let the element, I will say, of tragedy be lost, whether it be philosophy, theology, religion, or art. If we do, we lose something both peculiar and deep in Western culture. I've asked my colleagues in other cultures why this seems so peculiar to the West, and there are various answers, such as, in the West, with some very few exceptions like Pythagoras and Plato, there are very few thinkers or religions or philosophies or artists who do not think that this life we have is our one life. Even if there is a life after this life, as many clearly believe, nevertheless, this is it. We're not coming back here. And there's something peculiarly, the great affinity to the tragic vision of the Greeks with that, whereas other cultures, of course, with transmigration or karma, do not. Also, especially in Hindu cultures, and to some extent in Buddhist, the notion of Maya about contemporary life tends to make tragedy not a way to respond to suffering. Every great culture, of course, as Bharti observed, has ways that we can all learn from on the response to suffering. But there is something peculiar, I believe, I've come to believe about tragedy, that in the West at least should not be lost. So, with that preface and that title, I'll stop. And I will watch my time. Of definitions of tragedy in the West, there seems to be no end. To add another, as I shall attempt to do tonight, to that distinguished list from Aristotle forward may seem a wholly superfluous and exercise. Indeed, it would be if one could agree fully with any one of the famous definitions. I've learned from all of them, but I can't agree fully with any. Starting with Plato, Aristotle, with the Roman Seneca, Dr. Johnson, Coleridge, and then the great German thinkers, the great thinkers of tragedy and philosophy, Hegel, Schelling, Schopenhauer, Scheler, Freud, and above all, Nietzsche. However, I have remained unsatisfied with aspects of each, as anyone here will be with aspects of mine. Hence this effort, tentative, but for me necessary, to try to understand what seems to me sometimes like the cultural subconscious, perhaps even unconscious, of all Western culture in almost all its serious forms, religion, philosophy, and art, and ways of life, that is, of all of us. Every culture has its own ways, of course, of dealing with one of the great constants of any human life, namely intense suffering. Most cultures attempt to relate that vision of responding to suffering and sometimes the evil, whether natural or moral, that causes suffering, like the tsunami or the horror of the Holocaust in terms of human evil, with the other great constant of human life, namely those moments of intense joy. Moments that seem, as Eliot said, a time outside of time, where the sheer wonder and joy of life can overflow, and overwhelm us. The face of a person one loves or meets sometimes as a stranger, a strand of music, a moment in nature, or any of those other great moments that cannot but make one say yes to the glory of life. It is impossible to, I think, to deny either the great joy or the great suffering in every human life. A tragic vision, I believe, is one way, a Western way, as Nietzsche and Weil, the two I will discuss, saw so clearly, to refuse to divide life into moments of joy and moments of suffering, to distinguish them, of course, but to try to see, feel, understand life as a whole, involving great suffering and joy, and involving the ability to say yes to all that energy. Oppressed peoples, if you read their songs and their stories, almost always have this sense of suffering and joy together, as in the great African American slave narratives, and even more in the music of the blues, the spirituals, the gospels of our own American culture. I am lecturing tonight, however, more on the theories of tragedy than on the great artistic forms themselves, from the Greeks to Seneca to Shakespeare to the many today. To be sure, any attempt to define tragedy philosophically or theologically, that is to say, to try to develop a philosophy or theology of tragic wisdom that does not emerge from reflection on life itself and of its theology of God, and on these great attempts of the tragic artists and thinkers of our culture, would be close to useless. Some of our greatest thinkers, in my opinion, one I love more than any other in Christian theology, Augustine, had a tragic vision without a tragic theology, but could have had the latter as well, with a couple of changes. I will mention several examples of tragic art here in the hope that their resonance will help to clarify the more philosophical reflections on the theory of tragedy. A word on the kind of philosophy involved here. Many great contemporary scholars, Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault, in France, Arnold Davidson, Arthur Nussbaum, and many here, have come to deplore one aspect of our otherwise admirable modern Western culture: the curious separation of theory from practice, including specific practices, which Hadot, as you know, calls spiritual exercises. This separation was clearly not present in pre-modern, ancient, or medieval Western culture, nor is it present in other cultures, including highly modernized ones like East and Southeast Asia, influenced by Buddhism or Taoism or Hinduism or Confucianism. Among ancient Western schools of philosophy, all of them, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Platonists, the Cynics, the Skeptics, the Aristotelians, and of course later the Jewish and Christians, and much later the Muslims. All of them always tried to put together a vision of life as a whole, a theoria in its original sense, but always related to a way of life that was both informed by that vision and transfigured by it, and informing and transfiguring the vision. If you were a Stoic, like Marcus Aurelius, every day you would engage in exercises, spiritual exercises analogous to physical exercises, to heighten your awareness of the Stoic vision of how your logos or reason participates in the reasonable order, or the logos that the Stoic believed to pervade the whole universe. If you were an Epicurean, like Lucretius, you would try to render the Epicurean vision of an atomic world as constituting our universe without the order of the Stoics, to try to inform an honorable Epicurean way of life as Lucretius tried in this world of chance and fate. Most modern forms of philosophy have far more sophisticated theories of the universe, clearly, thanks to the stunning achievements of modern science and technology and the amazing adventures of modern and postmodern art, and some forms even of later modern and postmodern religion, than the ancients ever had, of course. But most modern philosophers and even theologians, with important exceptions like Kant or Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard or Wittgenstein or Foucault later in life, or Levinas or Lonergan, and many others, have somehow gone into the modern way of separating their theories on life and the universe from their own way of living, content, as Kierkegaard observed rather bitterly, including about himself, to build our castles of thought while living like everyone else next door in our disordered hut with our clumsy lives. Any ancient philosopher or theologian, the words were synonymous in the ancient period, would have thought that such an attempt at philosophy or theology was insane. A vision of life, even a great theory, should somehow also be on behalf of life and to influence it. A truly human, that is, humane life, unrelated to the whole of reality, however that whole be named, the cosmos, the gods, God, the logos, the one, articulated in one's theory. Simone Weil, in my judgment, one of the best readers of tragedy for Christianity and philosophy, was entirely right to say that the really difficult thing in life is to find the right names. Names, it's already difficult for how one make choices in life, free choices, as we might say, or relatively free. But the really difficult name is, what do we call what happens to us? What is not our choice, but we have to respond to? Do we call it simply, as so many postmodern writers, aleatory writers, Borges, DeLillo, and many others, chance? Or do we say, with many of the ancients, or with Nietzsche, who tried to recover the category, fate? Or do we say, with the ancient Stoics or the Jews or the Christians, even today, providence? Or do we, like the ancient Romans, not quite know what to say, so we put together fate and chance and call it fortune? Or, as moderns sometimes say, luck. The two tragic philosophers I am speaking of, Nietzsche and Weil, were among the exceptional modern philosophers who agreed with the ancients on a way of life and a vision should be related. They also agreed with one another, despite their otherwise intense disagreements, that tragedy had to be part of that vision and part of that way. But there is a difference. Except for the Stoic philosopher and playwright Seneca, the great influence on Shakespeare and the Renaissance, and possibly Plato. You remember the legend was that as a young man he wrote tragedies, and then he met Socrates and saw another way of life and burnt the tragedies. But I maintain with some others that in his final works, the Timaeus and the Laws, a tragic sensibility returned. The ancient philosophers on the whole did not possess, the philosophers, a tragic vision, especially the most influential philosopher of all on the history of how Westerners understood tragedy, Aristotle. He famously, of course, defended against Plato the cathartic experience of tragedy for the audience and individuals. But I don't see a moment in Aristotle where, unlike Plato or Nietzsche or Weil or Schopenhauer or many others, he does not allow the tragic vision to challenge his own ethics or his own metaphysics. In sum, we are at a point in our cultural history where, if it is the cultural subconscious, the present undercurrent of Western sensibility, tragedy, it demands explicit philosophical and theological attention, both as a vision of life as a whole, and as related to it a way of life for one to try to live whatever one's other commitments. Even if one has either a transfiguring scientific, philosophical, artistic, or religious visions informing whatever one thinks of tragedy. Nietzsche and Weil not only understood this, they tried to live it. Nietzsche, through his courageous and tragic, not pathetic as some have read it, his tragic nomadic life of illness, loneliness, until madness overcame him. Simone Weil, through her amazingly brief life of 34 years, in struggling for justice, where she developed even an entire social theory for the left because she considered it a spiritual exercise that was needed, for there was no good theory at the time, she judged. Informed, of course, in her case by her famous 3 mystical visions and her own odd, perhaps, but moving form of Platonism and of Christianity. She was clearly, as she said, in sensibility, a Christian, even a tragic Christian, though she could never become baptized or a member of a church. She was, in fact, as Harold Bloom says of William Blake, a church of one. Of course, I regret that there are other visions of the whole, there are other visions of the whole which in turn may transfigure a tragic vision even as they are transfigured by it. But the tragic undercurrent, I hold, still reigns in Western thought and sensibility. Is Nietzsche so wrong to speak of the optimism of reason, first let loose in ancient philosophy and after it in science and modern liberal thought, as trying to remove the tragic undercurrent, the acknowledgement of the deep and profound limits of reason? Read Einstein's troubled reflections on quantum theory's challenge to a unified field theory for science itself, and his insistence on the need for serious people to have both a tragic sensibility and a cosmic religion with an impersonal God, Spinoza. Does the great hope so alive in the biblical, God-centered religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, remove, as so many of their theologians seem to think, the tragic undercurrent in those religions? Reread Milton, who in fact developed an explicitly Christian tragedy, or read Racine. Reread much of Pascal and much of Augustine. Or, for that matter, is one of the greatest Christian visions of the West, called the Commedia, the Divine Comedy of Dante, really without tragedy? Surely not. This is true, I believe, in Dante. He called it, you remember, the Commedia. The word divine was added later. Despite his own unfortunate comments, I think, on the differences between tragedy and comedy. Dante's, as I will say at the very end, Dante's great yes to God and to life was possible only in the Paradiso and demanded a movement through the Inferno and the Purgatorio. Such at least is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is not, as some have claimed, I don't agree, that only the tragic vision is the true vision of our culture. Nietzsche in his early days did, not in his later. But that any vision of our culture, whether everyday or scientific, elite or non-elite, philosophical, artistic, or religious, which does not acknowledge and allow itself to be transformed by this cultural unconscious of the West, as I'm calling it, is, I think, doomed to ultimate irrelevancy for helping human beings understand their lives. This life, this one life that any one of us possess, to try to live in somehow a good and decent way, actively and courageously, and neither turning away from or pretending it does not exist in others and ourselves, the great suffering and the great joy of that life. I'm going to skip some and just go to my attempted definition. I skipped what tragedy is not, because the word is so badly used in the modern period. It's not, I don't feel good. It's not pathetic. Aristotle's perfectly right. It's not the horrible, and it's not the sad. Those are valuable in their own, perhaps, but that's not tragedy. A tragic vision, I maintain, involves three basic elements. First, necessity. Second, intense suffering, sometimes as a result of that necessity. And something like an active, I call it, human response to that suffering. It need not be heroic, but active. Together, these involve a yes to life as it is, as one actually tries to live it, as involving necessarily suffering and joy, and often both together. First, necessity, or as Simone Weil nicely called it, the reality of force that is present in every human life. We will all die. Those we love die. Disease comes, pain comes, separation comes. We have to deal with this. They may come as chance, they may come as fate through genetics, or they may come as providence, but they come. And when they come, they become force or necessity. It is for Weil what the tragic vision starting with the Iliad would never turn their eyes away from. If one believes in a strong sense of providence, as the ancient Stoics, the Jews, the Platonists, the Christians, later the Muslims clearly did and do, or alternatively, if one believes in a strong sense of fate, as the Greek tragedians did, as Nietzsche tried to do, and perhaps succeeded, with his famous amor fati, to accept your fate, to love your fate, to go forward with it. Remember, with the ancient tragedians, even the gods can't control fate. They can persuade it, like the end of the Oresteia, but they can't control it. We still, in most such accounts, have enough free will to respond to whatever comes to us as chance, fate, providence, fortune, as necessity in our lives. But nevertheless, we must find some way, some vision, some way of life to deal with this fate, this providence, this chance, this fortune, either well or badly. Now, I'm aware that there are strictly determinist positions in the West, classical Calvinism, for example, on double predestination, some readings of Freud on the power of the unconscious as our fate, some readings of Stoic providence, some readings of the last writings of Augustine, some readings of fate or kismet in Islam. These latter positions, I believe, however, are in fact rare in Western culture and in the specific religious and philosophical traditions where one finds them. And they are not, at least in my sense, tragic. We are, if they are true, we are in effect, as Plato says in the Laws, perhaps mere puppets in the hands of the gods who use us for their pleasure. Or as it says again in King Lear, Gloucester. That is to say that we would have no ability to respond to whatever happens to us, save in an already predetermined way. Perhaps this is why tragedy in its stronger form shows up in forms of Christianity, in the Christian case, that are either Calvinist or Jansenist, though it can show up in other forms. John Milton, good Calvinist, even Puritan as he surely was, deviated strongly from classical Calvinism on double predestination. Racine, great Jansenist Catholic tragedian, deviated strongly from that side of Jansen. Perhaps this is also why so much of the classics of our American post-Calvinist literature, at least in New England, Hawthorne, Melville, Dickinson, and later Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton, Henry James, even in our great films, especially in my opinion, Clint Eastwood, with a remarkably Calvinist sensibility and tragic, are so brilliantly, either consciously or unconsciously, part of that original sensibility. After all, it's very clear in cultures that doctrines may die, but the sensibility that the doctrines articulate die much later, much, much later, sometimes centuries. I do not claim in any way that any of those I have just mentioned are in any serious sense Calvinist in belief, but they surely are in sensibility. The same can be said of other post-Calvinist cultures like Dutch culture. The same can be found in post-Lutheran cultures, as when one sees a film of Ingmar Bergman. Nor does the post-death of God rejection by so many contemporary philosophers of any notion of providence, whether Stoic or Jewish or Christian, or for that matter, any notion of fate, including Nietzsche's attempt to rehabilitate the notion of fate, destroy a genuinely tragic vision for many. If, after all, as so much of postmodern art at least suggests, chance, the aleatory, is all that happens to us, then there is no absolute necessity, as there is for any notion of providence or fate. However, that does not mean necessarily the loss of a tragic vision, for there remains just as powerful a force resulting from chance. What philosophers initially just logically call contingent, not absolute necessity. Logically, if Socrates sits, he necessarily sits. But there is no absolute necessity for Socrates to sit. It happens, however, that he is now sitting. And it happens, that's what he has to deal with. A contingent necessity. Existentially, even chance then yields a tragic vision. This is crucial. Even if one held that there is no such reality as the Stoics thought through the order of the world, as the Jews, Christians, and Muslims thought through their brilliant rethinking of how God as creator and redeemer orders but does not totally determine the world. Nor is there fate in any strict sense, except in a very general sense that modern genetics may suggest. There is still for all of us chance, and chance, once it happens, is now my contingent necessity to which I must respond as much as if it were fate or providence. If I am told by my doctor that I have inoperable cancer, that is the contingency become now for me a necessity I now have to respond to, well or badly. And what resources do I have for that? Tragedy, I suggest, helps. Even if one believed, I repeat, that there was no providence or fate that in any genuine way destined me to have this cancer, but it just came about through chance, nevertheless, it is here. It is now the necessity with which I must now deal one way or the other. This was what so bothered Democritus, and then why Epicurus added the swerve to try to control chance somewhat, and Lucretius. If chance rules, suppose that the Romans were brilliant because they couldn't decide between chance and fate, so they said fortune. So does Shakespeare mostly. He mostly speaks because he's more influenced by the Romans than the Greeks. A fortune, neither fate nor chance. Fortune can be either. Writers I admire like DeLillo or Borges or Nabokov. Necessity, contingent necessity, and therefore a tragic sensibility is hardly eliminated. It is relocated from some form of providence or fate of the ancients or of religious figures to contingent necessity. It just happened. Deal with it. This is not just a matter of a limit situation like the announcement of a fatal disease. This chance reality with which I must necessarily deal well or badly is present from birth. We now know how much the young Heidegger in Being and Time took, since we have his seminars now, from Augustine on being thrown into time and on entering in with Befindlichkeit, with attunement, with it's Augustinian affectus. When you enter a room, you're already attuned one way or another to it. You're dealing with what happens, what's there. I did not choose to be born, to my memory. Indeed, my existence or yours is, as you well know, statistically most improbable. The chance that my parents mated when they did, and so on with their parents and their parents back in time, to our original ancestors, whoever they may have been, is what? Is somehow part of who anyone in this room is. You can call it fate, or chance, or providence, but you have to deal with it. For here I am, or you are, born into a particular family, a particular culture, language, moment of history, society, with particular genetic structure, all of which can be part of that original chance, fated, providential beginning. All of which become necessities that poorly or at the limit almost wholly, if I don't respond, tragedy is always response, determine who it is I will become and how I will respond. This isn't true even only of these great limit situations of great suffering, great tragedy, and from history or from nature. Society itself, even very polite society, provides it. Henry James and Edith Wharton, as well as great tragic comic writers like Molière, show how if you happen to live in a particular highly civilized society with very strict norms and rules, spoken and unspoken, about what you should and shouldn't do, you're very determined whether you will it or no. And break the rules, and you will pay the price. It becomes, as Simone Weil says correctly of Molière, that he's not so much a great comic writer as a great comic tragic writer who shows what happens to people in highly restrictive societies like his when you break the rules. In a way, with the reflections I have just given on absolute and contingent necessity, it is, I repeat, merely a further reflection on what I consider Simone Weil's brilliant comment. It all depends on what word you use, if you're thoughtful about what you're saying, for what you do to what happens to you. Chance, fate, providence. Indeed it does. But a tragic response is either possible or lacking in any of these responses. The second element in a tragic vision is, of course, the reality of suffering caused by whatever necessity or force now impinges on one. Like the poor people trapped suddenly, even in their villages on the sea in a tsunami. It is so obvious that a tragic vision is a response to such suffering, whether it be naturally or humanly caused, humanly in history, that one needly hard speak of this at length, I hope, one does not need to fan that flame of recognition. However, I am persuaded that some brief reflection may be needed here on suffering too, for in my judgment, one of the greatest attractions of the original Greek tragic vision of life and its recuperation in Shakespeare and others is that it does not attempt an answer to the question as its principal response, why do we suffer? Tragedy in that sense is not an answer so much as a question even for the believer in God or the gods or the reason-laden philosophers of life. Tragic vision tends to shift the ground from answer to question, from thought even to feeling, and reflecting on suffering, from why to how can I respond, whatever the why, with yes, as a human being to the suffering as well as the joy in life. Tragedy is not, of course, alone in refusing to say that the why question is principal for suffering. Many of our great mystics do, as Meister Eckhart's famous advice to his fellow Christians, learn to live without a why, ohne warum. And Kant, I've always thought, is entirely right philosophically. All theodicies fail. Despite the insistent efforts over the centuries of Western philosophers and theologians, in particular religions and philosophies, to provide an answer. Martin Luther always made much more sense to me when he speaks of how he is terrified at times of God, and all he can do is flee to the cross, that is, to the sense of the love of God disclosed in the cross, not to a theological answer. The mystics in the religions are, in this sense, on why of suffering, usually wiser than the philosophers or theologians, at least those attempting a theodicy, or its secular alternative, an anthropodicy. Buddhism and Taoism, for example, are the religions that try to teach, to enlighten one, to cease clinging, finally, to one's ego and its insistent why, to stop craving for an answer to that why and learn to let go, to life. So, in my judgment, do the great tragic visions. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Shakespeare, and many others. A second necessary clarification: despite the overnumerous books on suffering and evil, the issues of suffering and evil, I've come to believe, should not be taken as if they were always together. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Evil, of course, causes intolerable suffering. Think of the Holocaust, or the Middle Passage, or what happened to the Native Americans in this country. Any evil that can be stopped should be stopped, as when all of us, I think, consider the Second World War, but not the First, as a good war that was worth the horrifying evil and suffering it involved. It was worth the fight. But the suffering of life itself, in life itself, as much as the joy of life, what of that? Is there any reasonable answer to why suffering? Again, no. For evil, even radical evil, philosophy and theology should try to think as best they can by referring, in theology's case, to the Scriptures, and to such texts as Job and Lamentations and the Gospel of Mark, and never ignore such texts or the pain and power they bring to any serious Christian or Jewish reader. Are human beings so constituted that not only that not only is our problem that we have conscious error, then more conversation and argument can help, as the philosophers rightly tell us, like Habermas. But suppose our problem also includes something like the religions always thought it included, and the tragedies always did. Something less like conscious error than systemic unconscious distortion. Then whatever you call it, primal ignorance with the Hindus and Buddhists, evil and sin with the Western religions, is here. One must deal with it. And it is not just a conscious error. It is not just the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims that speak of grace. One of the great debates in Eastern Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, between Pure Land and Zen is our situation such that what we need is self-power, as in Zen, or other power, as in Pure Land? But even the self-power of Zen is not the ego, ever. There is usually always a teacher, koans, texts, some other power that helps one forward. Sin, as Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard saw so clearly, cannot be understood in its Christian sense unless you first understand grace. It is not moral faults. It is an entire orientation. Just as avidya, or primal ignorance of Buddhists and Hindus, does not mean if only I could think more clearly, I could deal with my problem. It means primal ignorance, and some other power is needed. So it is, I think, when trying to understand the relationship of the great human suffering to the genuine sin and tragedy and ignorance of human life and the need for other power. As Milton brilliantly in Samson Agonistes, as Racine in Phaedra, as Pascal in all his works show, grace does not remove tragedy. In many ways, it clarifies. It may be true, as Ronald Knox said, that Pascal, clearly the most intelligent man of his age, a great mathematician, a great scientist, even a great technologist who invented the present public transportation system in Paris. He was something. He would have been very good as the village atheist in the 17th century. But unfortunately for Pascal, grace caught him, and he became a Christian pessimist with a tragic vision of life. A great one. In sum, suffering and evil are distinct questions, often though of course they are often linked in our experience and our thought. Myself, I think one of the great difficulties of Augustine is that he rejected tragedy and had a tragic vision. He rejected it for a good reason. He thought, our God, the God of the Bible, must control fate. Zeus does not. But then the only alternative becomes everything is blamed on human beings, because it clearly can't be God. And at the same time he shows we're thrown into life. We didn't choose much of what we find in life. The word tragedy covers those. The word sin is equally necessary. And there is inherited sin as well of where we find ourselves. But did he need that final theology when he got very angry at the Pelagians? Perhaps. In some, suffering and evil are distinct questions. And there may be very good reason to drop at times the why question as the principal question on suffering and acknowledge with Kant the limits of reason. Only after Kant finished the three critiques did the problem of radical evil shift his mind and make him right religion within the limits. I think of him as a tragic thinker of modernity, not the optimist, people think of him as, because he both sees the great power of reason and the great limits of reason, especially in dealing with radical evil. The tragic vision drops usually a why, or poses one tentatively as an Oedipus or Antigone, and tries to see life as it is in all its puzzlement, its unknowability, its suffering, its joy, its energy, its depletion. The tragic vision tries as well to give what Nietzsche nicely named an active, not reactive response to the suffering one finds in one's own life or others. Hence my final section on such necessity and suffering, an active response. Here I turn more to Nietzsche than to Weil, as in the first two sections. In direct contradiction of his original hero, Schopenhauer, who has a great defense of tragedy, but Schopenhauer is a no to life. It's a no. And tragedy as art in general is an escape, and he discovers Buddhism as an escape. But it's a no. Nietzsche wants it to be a yes to life. That's what I think he's so right on about tragedy. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides are a yes to life, as are the religions. There are other, there are great no's. I don't mean there aren't great no's. Beckett is a great no. But Beckett's no is partly great because it's a comic tragic no. I read his biography. I loved it. When he was a young man, he was part of the resistance, German resistance, Irish, of course, but living in France. And one night they actually succeeded, which it wasn't easy, to blow up a railroad track and stop the train. And he was with his friends the next morning, the biographer tells us, and he was also in love and young. And it was a beautiful Paris day in a beautiful village. Good wine, good food, and they did it. And his friend said to him, Sam, we did it. We actually did it finally. Because they had tried many times. Beckett said, yeah, we did. We actually did it this time. His friend said, it's a beautiful day today. Beckett, it is, it really is. And his friend said, it makes you happy to be alive. Beckett said, I wouldn't go that far. That's a great no. He was willing to go some of the way. Nietzsche, from joyous wisdom and thus spoke Zarathustra forward, dropped all appeals to what he had in the birth of tragedy, some kind of metaphysical consolation via tragedy. Dropped that. To the final, to Zarathustra, which he spoke of, you remember, and I believe him, as a revelation. And he spoke of as, finally I understand what inspiration means. I didn't invent this, it came to me. You go to Zils Maria, you can see the rock of where it came. Once more, the eternal return. The notion of the eternal return as the meaning of the will to power, as he didn't hesitate to say the religious meaning, became a further articulation not just of tragedy as in the birth of tragedy, but what he longed for and only found with Zarathustra, a tragic philosophy, tragic wisdom, to have them both together. Nietzsche had found his voice, a tragic wisdom, a tragic philosophy, a religious philosophy. Of course, he already had his yes in his most famous move for interpreting tragedy in his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, his insistence on the reality of Dionysian energy, the energy of life itself, life for Nietzsche without beginning, without end, without purpose, life both beautiful, sublime, terrifying, fascinating, holy, without any other reason than life. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's brilliant insistence that this Dionysiac reality of life itself had to be rendered in form, in limit, in beauty, in harmony, in Apollo, freed him even then to read tragedy as the great active yes to life. in all its wonder and cruelty, its beauty and its terror. In his later work, Zarathustra becomes the prophet of Dionysus and Nietzsche the prophet of Zarathustra. And he reached what he had always hoped to reach, to be not only an artist, as is what he says he is in The Birth of Tragedy, but an artist and a philosopher, like the Plato he so loved and fought. As he said, I think correctly, who is Socrates? The great enemy of tragedy for Nietzsche. The other life, the life of reason, the optimism of reason for Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, who is Socrates? Socrates is he who does not write, like Jesus or the Buddha. Who is Plato? Plato is he who writes. Who am I? I shall be my own Plato to my own Socrates, if it happens. But he believed that the Dionysian power was present. Of course, he learned this through Greek tragedy and the role of music, which we don't have, of course, or know what exactly it was, but it had to have been Dionysiac, from what they tell us in the chorus. And from Wagner and Schopenhauer, whom he later rejected, but he never rejected what they said about music as the principal art. But the music had to be Dionysian, not Apollinian. It had to be more Wagner or Beethoven than Bach or Vivaldi, more rock and roll and rap than popular ballads, more like the spirituals and blues than like classical improvisational jazz. It was, after all, Aristotle, whom I've ignored up till now, who helped us all to see forever the importance of the plot in the tragic form now, for forming the familiar myths and stories into the new stories of an Aeschylus, a Sophocles, a Euripides, a tragedy, familiar stories. It was Hegel, another great philosopher on tragedy. Shame Nietzsche ignored him. He ignored him because Schopenhauer hated him. It was Hegel who showed that some tragedies, above all for him Antigone, the greatest tragedies for Hegel, are mistaken if you look in tragedy for a conflict between good and evil. Sometimes it's that, but more often Hegel believed it is between two too narrowly conceived goods. And we are always looking for the evil other to demonize and refusing to admit that sometimes there are two very narrow goods that inevitably conflict. It was Simone Weil who showed how a genuinely Greek tragic vision was never merely aesthetic, as Nietzsche originally thought, but always also philosophical and religious, without contradiction. But it was Nietzsche, I think, who thought that you could take the tragic vision, if you were serious, into any aesthetic, religious, or philosophical yes to life. I'm going to skip, so I'll end active. I say other good things about Nietzsche, which I won't say here to make a criticism. But on two crucial matters, Nietzsche, I think, was wrong. An active response to life, as he rightly demanded, and he said tragedy provides, otherwise it's farce, it's pathetic, or it's just sad, or just horrible. An active, tragic response to life, one hopes, can and does include such a yes. It did not in Schopenhauer, it does not in Beckett, but it does in Aeschylus, clearly. Half of the Greek tragedies we have end in hope, which people forget when they make the word tragic equivalent to hopeless, which it never was. But an active, not a, in Nietzsche's terms, reactive. All I do is react to life. I won't take responsibility for how I respond to what's happened. May also suggest more of a no than Nietzsche allowed. An ethical resistance to the evil causing the suffering. A demand for justice, as one can see in some of Sophocles, as one can see in Aeschylus' insistence that at the very founding in Athens of a law court and of law, the Areopagus, is the only thing that can break the cycle of revenge with which humans otherwise kill themselves. As in much of Euripides and his anti-war great plays, as in some of Shakespeare, much indeed of Shakespeare and many of his modern followers. Nietzsche was, after all, spared the horrors of the 20th century, but we have not been. So that Simone Weil or Benjamin or Kafka or many others, strong, active respondents all to what was happening, could not manage the overwhelming yes that Nietzsche demanded. Perhaps Nietzsche could not have either if he had lived that long. They did manage, however, an active, strong, but somehow more tentative yes, and sometimes no, almost interchangeably, the no in order to add the demand to resist injustice and evil. Tragedy should never be an occasion, as it has been used, of course, to just speak of fatalism, or what can you do anyway, or there's no use resisting. No, Nietzsche and Weil were entirely right. The tragic yes is also a yes that demands resistance to any of the evil that one finds in life, but clear-headed, realizing that one must do it, but one must not assume one should succeed. Nor does the new century of the 21st thus far provide much relief from the relentless series of horrors of the 20th. But Sophocles too, think of Oedipus, Tyrannus, and Shakespeare, think of Lear, were active, strong, never reactive, weak, resentful respondents to life, and did not usually articulate Nietzsche or Aeschylus's strong yes. I have never read the life of a saint where I thought this was one of the toughest people I ever read about. Not reactive at all, active, empowered, and rarely too optimistic about life. Perhaps Nietzsche should have, the great exception is Francis of Assisi, but he suffered so much. The history of his time was so terrible. His physical illnesses were so awful. His giving up, running his order was so, I mean, it's Buddhists taught me in these Buddhist conversations that perhaps Francis is the greatest religious figure the West produced. Because it is this extraordinary yes from God to life and to all of life. Not only, as with the other great religious thinkers, to only human life, although so the suffering in animal life and in nature itself, as we are more and more aware. Extraordinary man. Perhaps Nietzsche should have turned as well to his love of Aristophanes. For there is, after all, the great alternative of the comic vision in the West, and Aristophanes articulated it. In fact, in Birth of Tragedies, every criticism that Nietzsche gives of Socrates and the optimism of reason, and of Euripides' collapse before the sophists, is from Aristophanes, from the greatest comic vision. Furthermore, Nietzsche famously, in his later preface to his young work, The Birth of Tragedy, says, "You know, I was very young, and I was right, basically, but I should have learned to laugh more." What we have, one final note to Nietzsche. It is one thing to remove tragedy from the reactive, weak, and resentful announcements that it is true many in culture under various names of philosophy or good manners or religion or whatever, of what is good and what is evil. You want to go beyond good and evil. In these distorted versions of Stoicism, of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, or of secular liberal ethics. But that's not what they are. Read them. Certainly read their founders and those who actually lived them as lives. They are very active responses to life, and active responses that take both the suffering and the joy of life with seriously, and say a yes to life and to the God who created and redeems life, without abandoning the realism of a tragic vision. It is quite another thing to notice that the yes in some of the greatest tragedies, the end of the Bacchae or the end of Lear, do not, it is true, reach what could be called, I always thought it was wrong to translate Elios and Phobos, the way it's usually translated into English, fear and compassion. Sometimes it is like the end of the Bacchae. Sometimes it's more accurate to say awe, just awe at what has happened, and understanding or some kind of acceptance. It depends on which tragedy, which catharsis is appropriate, I think. But Nietzsche had a problem. In English, I'm happy to say, we have two words. We have the word pity, and we have the word compassion. I love reading Nietzsche in German because it's such beautiful German, and I regretfully admit, usually find German beautiful to read. But Nietzsche, oh yes. He's always using Mitleid rather. I'm asked my German friends, is there another word, as in English? But he's always against it. Well, I too, I don't want to be pitied. Does anyone in the room wish to be pitied? Pity is patronizing. Pity is refusing the other to be other. Pity is reacting, not acting. Pity is a refusal of compassion with the other as other in our common life. Nietzsche, in his thought, though not his exceptionally, to me, admirable life, the local people in the villages sometimes called him Il Santo, feared compassion, including his own. He feared that it would only remove one from facing honestly the tragedy of life and from saying yes to life by pretending it was all so nice, and just involving oneself in self-pity and patronizing everyone else with pity. Well, sometimes, to be sure, that happens. He's not wrong. But it's never what any of the great religions or any of the great philosophies, including his own, was about. They were always about, almost always, there are exceptions, Schopenhauer, a yes to life. And a yes that you can find even in Euripides, whom I like, even if neither Weil nor Nietzsche do. And neither of them do. It is Euripides who sees at the end of the Bacchae that sometimes we seem better than the gods. Those times when we learn to have compassion for one another and know how we all go through it. As Pascal, the great Christian tragic thinker, said, "It is odd how cruel we are to one another. We are in fact all on death's row waiting our turn. Why these actions? Why this refusal to face the reality we are in?" Simone Weil, in her formulation of the tragic vision as a vision that also empowers, as it did in her life and her thought, a struggle for justice and for compassion, understood that tragedy should not be a removal from life into a comfortable fatalism, but a new empowerment to fight injustice, but fight it honestly and with open eyes. I admit that my reading of the elements involved in the tragic vision as an active response to suffering caused by the necessity, whether chance, fate, providence, each of us must face in life, will face in life, always face in life, begins to dissolve at the end. This yes and no I give to Nietzsche's reading of what counts as an active response. I do not believe with anyone like George Steiner that you need a hero for tragedy or a heroic response, which is why I say active, never heroic. I agree with Brecht, pity the land that needs a hero. But we do need active responses. And we do need to acknowledge, as Arthur Miller, so recently dead, insisted, that ordinary people like Willy Loman, who fought for his dignity in an impossible system which he neither understood nor could live with, deserved the attention to be paid to his tragedy. Or that Blanche Dubois, as self-deceptive, as lying, as desperate as she was also a survivor, and something of an artist of life, and someone who had compassion for others, and that her fate, though not the fate of a hero of an Antigone, is a fate that is tragic, that tragedy returns. I'm very happy to see the recent Marxist readings of affirmation of tragedy, unusual, given past Marxist readings, especially the recent book by Terry Eagleton, or his teacher before him years ago, Raymond Williams, or the recent feminist rethinkings of tragedy by French thinkers like Nicole Leroux, or in this country, Judith Butler in her brilliant reading of Antigone. For it is surely time not to allow tragedy to be gathered and handled by the nostalgic for heroes, or the nostalgic for ages that probably never were and certainly shouldn't be desired. No, the tragic vision is a vision that can be born by an honest facing of what happens to us and how we respond to chance, to fate, to providence, to necessity. Active, not necessarily heroic. A final note. To admire a tragic vision, I think, as the wrongly abandoned vision in much of Western culture, is not to consider it the only or the deepest vision of our culture, but it is to insist that any of the other great philosophical, religious, and artistic visions should incorporate the tragic vision and its active responses to necessity, suffering, and evil, and above all, its reintroduction of the serious consideration of how we all face and try to name what happens to us and our need to respond to that. Now, with poorly used words, or unused at all, or unthought about, chance, fate, fortune, luck, providence. Whatever religion, philosophy, theology, or artistic vision and way of life that ignores these realities is, I think, finally not going to prove very helpful to anyone. I agree with Emmanuel Levinas that any philosophy that cannot help you face the evil and suffering of life isn't worth too much time. But my final suggestion, one of the greatest works in Christian culture, my culture, in Western culture, my culture, Dante's Commedia, can hardly be said to lack a deep and tragic element, as one sees in the Inferno and how serious life is and one's choices, and the Purgatorio. It is foolish in my judgments for Christian thinkers, like even someone I admire like Reinhold Niebuhr, to write books called Beyond Tragedy, or to speak of Dante as, oh thank God, life is comedy, commedia, not tragedy. And yet, Dante found his word for his yes to life and to the God who created and redeemed life to be sure as commedia, in a theological sense. Not as too many think of it, as a vulgar and trivializing belief in rewards and punishments. Not even principally, though he believed in it, about afterlife or resurrection of the body. No, these beliefs were secondary, in my judgment, to the tragic comic greatness of Dante's yes to life and God. His yes is to the God as the very energy creating and redeeming life, affecting all and affected by all, suffering with life at times, the yes beyond, but never without, modern tragedy's yes in his final line. But rather than end with my words, I'd rather end with better ones. Or did I leave it? I had Simone Weil here. Did I leave it? Yeah, it's a little pamphlet called the Iliad. Well, I know what she says, basically. Though she says it better than I'm about to say. She says that this vision that helped to determine the West for her, first in the Iliad and then in the Greek tragedies, then in the Gospel of Mark, then in other texts, she says, is usually forgotten. But it should not be, and it keeps reemerging happily in our culture. And it will last as long as people know that there is fate. There are things that happen to one, and especially to others, and there is such a thing as compassion and justice. Her final words. If there are any observations or questions, I shall be happy to try to respond, so to listen. Please, sir.
Hi, Father. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
I'm curious, and this may not be a question if my memory is not serving me correctly. I should preface this. In the last part of your talk, you talked about the active response. And you said at one point that the tragic yes demands resistance.
Yeah.
Am I getting that right? Is that?
Yes. That's me, not Nietzsche.
That's you, not Nietzsche.
Right.
And in, I believe, plurality and ambiguity, your characterization of religion was resistance.
I was quoting. No, you're right. I was not quoting it. Yes, that was me.
Okay, so my question is this.
Metz's one word is interruption. That's what I was confused from. Mine is resistance.
So my question then is, does the tragic yes demand religion, or does it demand theology?
I think, I try to defend this at much greater length, which it needs. I think it is a religious response, yes. I do.
In a religious response, do you see that in Nietzsche? Do you see that in Weil? Do you see that in...
I see it in both of them, certainly, yes. Yeah, certainly in Nietzsche, even in The Birth of Tragedy, much less after Zarathustra, which is, in my opinion, so clearly religious, you can't miss it. And he doesn't pretend otherwise. He says it's revelation, it's inspiration. But even in The Birth of Tragedy, the whole notion of the Dionysiac is a religious notion, and the insistence, which scholars, not just Nietzsche, hold, that ancient Greek tragedy begins in the religious ritual for the god Dionysus, right? And doesn't remove that religious aspect. And Nietzsche certainly doesn't by emphasizing the Dionysiac. Nietzsche is clearly anti-Christian, very clearly. And he is clearly atheist. It's not exactly the right way to put it. He's death of God. But he is equally clearly, in my judgment, a serious religious thinker, whom I take very seriously. Okay, does that respond? And part of that seriousness is tragic.
How he was a serious religious
Well, his whole attempt is a yes to life exactly as it is, not as we would like it to be. That's religion. About what is life, and what do I say, and what do I make of how much suffering, evil, sin, ignorance, goodness, beauty, joy it involves. Right? And he wouldn't want that to be only a philosophy for him. And Nietzsche's issue to me is the following. In The Birth of Tragedy, you remember, he said, life can only be justified aesthetically, as art. Drops that. Just as he drops Schopenhauer's metaphysics and Wagner's metaphysical music as consolations we shouldn't accept if we face the tragedy. But something happened to Nietzsche with Zarathustra, which is so clearly a religious. It is, of course, a religious text that makes parodies of New Testament parables, parodies of Platonic dialogues, parodies even of some of his own work. And it's nevertheless, it's a deeply serious and not merely parodic text. Right? And then he has, I think, what he wanted. Because remember, he tried to leave the classics department and go to the philosophy department, but they wouldn't have it. And then finally he left the university, partly for health, very young, and wandered. He wanted a philosophy that was a tragic philosophy. So he dropped that it's only aesthetic, you see. But he felt he had to attack the usual morality and the usual metaphysics in order to have it be a serious one. So he attacks Christianity very strongly. He attacks Platonism very strongly. He attacks anything he would call, I was using his language with active, you notice. I left out a long section which explained it more. It's Nietzsche who invents the language active or reactive in your response. What he cared about was an active response. Am I responding? You know, there's a very interesting debate in French thought between Bataille and Caillou. Their break, when they had been working together in the 30s, was Bataille, in their readings of Nietzsche, that's when the new Nietzsche came into France, left-wing France. The right-wing Nietzsche was already there, alas. But apparently Bataille never taught a class without some point in the class standing up and saying, "Don't forget tragedy." It's a little odd, Bataille. But he read Nietzsche as the will to tragedy. And Caillou, I think, more exactly read Nietzsche as the will to tragic wisdom. Right? Both cases are will to power, of course. But Caillou would admit that the second only really occurs from Zarathustra forward. But that was their break. And it's a good issue on Nietzsche, I would say. Yes, someone over here, sir? No? Oh, I answered. Oh. Yes, please. Hi.
Was I right to hear that the question why is you're skeptical?
Yeah.
And I liked your last part the best also about the active response. And I'm wondering whether the question why isn't important to that active response. And or how would, for a truly tragic sensibility or for the tragic vision, what would be the definition of hope? Not, of course, confusing hope with optimism.
Right.
I just kept thinking about what would happen if someone like Dr. King were tragic, you know, in your sense, and this confidence that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice weren't there.
Well, that can, as in his case, be a tragic vision, yeah. A hopeful tragic vision. I see tragedy most, I think I did say at one point, 50% of the tragedies that are left, which is all we have from the Greeks, you know, most of them are lost, but we seem to have the good ones, end with something like hope, not hopelessness. Right? You know, the Greeks are very odd on hope. Hope the Greek word elpis, it's ambiguous for them. For most of us, hope is for me, for example, hope is usually a very positive characteristic because it's the biblical hope. It's the promises of God and the hope that comes from the promises of God. It's not just me, it's God promising. Right? And that's different. For the Greeks, you have to take them one by one. Thucydides, whom I taught many years ago, uses the word elpis or hope twice in the whole of his long book, which I read as the tragedy of Athens itself. And it means self-delusion. Something bad's going to happen. You're kidding yourself. You remember in Hesiod, Pandora's box, the last thing out is hope, and you don't know whether it's good or bad. Other Greeks, like Plato, hope is positive. Right? Now, I think in our culture, it is so influenced, hope, by Christianity and Judaism that it became almost automatically, even people against it, positive. Or they just negated it. I had a very, very good friend whom I cared for very much, a writer. Never read a writer. Read her. She's one of the great tragic writers. Caroline Blackwood is her name. She's better known in Britain than here. Though her books are here. Caroline Blackwood. And she asked me once what I was writing. This book I was writing. And I said, well, I was thinking, well, what shall I say about it? I said, well, I think, Caroline, it's about hope. And she said, hope? Darling, that's the worst. No, I can understand that response. I really can. But I don't agree with it, obviously. Because if you have any sense whatsoever of providence or of hope. When I said, by the way, I don't mean never ask why. Of course we ask why. That's part of who we are as human beings, to question why. I just mean to refuse a response to life, especially a yes, because you don't have the ultimate why, is stupid and foolish. And that's why I think the Buddhists are so right, and Meister Eckhart is so right, and the great religions are so right. No one has the ultimate why. That's all I meant. I didn't mean, I'm asking why all the time. My nieces for Christmas gave me a T-shirt that reads why. So I didn't mean that. Fred, please.
Just a thought on the Eleos Phobos.
Yeah.
What about mercy?
Yeah.
In other words, there's some way in which I would agree with Nietzsche that both pity and compassion have a contemptible. As he read compassion, we saw it.
Yes. Yeah.
Contemptible side to it. But mercy, misericordia, as we learned once.
I'm trying to.
That is more. It seems to me that's more central to the point you're getting at.
That's a very good point, Fred. Yeah, it might well be. It's certainly, I use mercy, but you're helping me as always. I do have discussions of mercy when I discuss God. I tend to have it less, I tend to move to the category compassion when I discuss human beings, but you may be right that it would be more active, more powerful. Is that part of what you mean?
Not only that, but it has built into it the concern for justice.
Yes, indeed it does.
But in a way that you talk about going beyond the
Yeah. Indeed it does.
the why, so also you go beyond justice in some sense.
That's very helpful, thank you. That's very helpful.
Only in a way that's very sentimental, powerful love.
Yeah. You know, it's in many ways the few less important, more important points. I was in for many years, as I think you were at one point, a Christian Buddhist discussion group. And we wisely, by the leaders of the group, we all immediately wanted to talk about God and emptiness, right? That's what we do, theologians, philosophers. And I just couldn't understand why they're saying ultimate reality is sunyata, empty. What's wrong with God, as a way of speaking, right? And they, Abe Masao and John Cobb, very wisely, Marty does a lot of this, said to us, no, you're not going to do that. The first year you're going to talk about what do you think is the problem. 3 Buddhist speakers, 3 Christian speakers, there are about 10 of each. So we spoke about what do you think sin is, and what do you think primal ignorance is. In the second year we were allowed to speak about what's the response, not solution, but response. I gave one of the papers on what do Christians mean by redemption, and what is, the Buddhist papers on what is nirvana or enlightenment. Only then, in the third year, were we allowed to speak of emptiness and God. And it's, I think, partly for the reasons you were saying. Then in the fourth year, we had to say what we thought we had learned. Most of the Christians, including me, and this is a very interesting group of Christian theologians and Buddhist thinkers. Buddhist thinkers were mainly Japanese, so there was mainly Mahayana. Most of the Christians said what I said. Well, I learned several things. I learned, for example, finally to read a figure in my own tradition I never knew how to read before, Meister Eckhart, their favorite Christian thinker, for good reasons. I also realized, as I said tonight without quoting them, how radical a figure Francis of Assisi was, how sentimentalized he's become in the West, when in fact he was a very radical thinker, loving all nature, not just humans. And Buddhists taught me that. I mean, I could have learned it from fellow Christians, I'm sure, but in fact Buddhists taught me. And the other thing I said was, I finally think I learned how you can think the category God with a category like emptiness, that they're not the same at all. It's really a difference, but it's not a difference as if there's nothing to say to one another, right? And the great mystics like Eckhart or Simone Weil with her attempt to understand how to speak God, you also have to speak the void at times. They seem to have always known that, right? And what fascinated me was what the Buddhists said, that they had learned. They thought that most of the Christians, I would say, had learned, the first 2 were interesting, but they're sort of learning how to read your own tradition. They're less interesting than, you know, emptiness is not such a strange category, or the void, if you think with God. And the other thing that they said they learned most, Abe Masao especially, as a Japanese, says, I've been a Japanese Buddhist all my life. He was a convert from Pure Land, other power, to Zen, self-power. And he said, I have always had compassion, the great Buddhist virtue, the greatest of the Buddhist virtues, like love is supposed to be the greatest of the Christian virtues. I've always had compassion for the non-indigenous people in Japan, especially the Ainu people and the Koreans who have been there for generations and are still not accepted. And he said, but it wasn't till I started listening to Christians and reading them, and Jews, that I realized maybe it's your point, but the reverse, but it's the same point, I think, that maybe it wasn't enough to have compassion for individual Ainu people, which he always had. And he's a very, I trust that he always did that. That maybe you have to change the structures of the society. Maybe you have unjust structures that demand that compassion isn't real unless you do that. And that's sort of why I made the emphasis I did, because that's Simone Weil also. As you know, she loved Buddhism. And I've never met another thinker like her who had this sense that the void, compassion, justice are all somehow involved, as you were just saying. You know? So I'm not in any way disagreeing. In fact, I'm very thankful for what you said, because if you say only justice, Part of the problem I have with Levinas is he doesn't give enough attention to mercy and love, and in that sense, compassion. And it's very unfortunate, in my opinion. I have to give a paper in 3 weeks at the philosophy department in Chicago conference. They said, they asked me 6 months ago when it didn't seem so difficult about the conference is on the second person singular. What that means, of course, is in English we don't say thou. In French and German, the other, and it was for a political reason, as you know, because the Quakers were dragged to court because they would dare to quote thou an aristocrat and claim equality. Right? Don't thou me. So they just got rid of thou in English on the whole. So it's called the second person singular. It means thou. And so I decided to speak on the friend, thou, the friend or the neighbor. Nietzsche and Levinas, and then my own reflection. Because you remember in Zarathustra with Nietzsche and with genealogy, and of course before that with Aristotle, but I'm talking about Nietzsche here, when Zarathustra says, I preach the friend, not the neighbor. And Levinas, to me, one of his greatest moves is even beyond totality and infinity, where it's the other as other. He shifts the language in otherwise than being to the neighbor. That's the issue, the neighbor. And the neighbor is exactly, I think, what you say, that compassion. Otherwise, we're always demonizing the other or patronizing the other. You know German so much better than I. I kept asking German friends, what do Germans say when they want to make a distinction between a good kind of compassion, Mitleid, and patronizing pity? Is there a word? I haven't been able to find it.
Well, I don't really know German that well, although I've translated a lot to pay tuition. But I don't think they'd use Mitleid for the condescending type.
Nietzsche's the only word he uses, and he does usually mean it negatively.
He really is referring to.
He's referring to reactive.
He's referring to his sorrow.
Yeah. That's why you say it'd be better to.
Of the others suffering together with the gladness that you're not undergoing it.
Yeah.
But the guilt that makes you try to relieve it for your own sake rather than for the others.
You mean he's talking of it always with ressentiment, with reactive response? Yeah. But why can't he say at some point? I keep looking. I reread all of him actually about a year ago because I have a chapter on him in my book. And I like him very much. Why couldn't he admit that compassion is not necessarily weak and reactive? It seems to me it's fairly obvious sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Shaler, as you know, takes this up.
Yes.
Yeah. Am I missing though? Because it puzzles me, because he is in fact, from everything you read about the man, he's in fact a very compassionate man, Nietzsche. Everyone who knew him says this. And therefore, it's puzzling. Is it?
That both two such different people, as Balthasar and Strauss, both agreed that Nietzsche wanted Christian virtues without Christianity.
I think that's exactly right.
Which is kind of what you said.
I think it's exactly right. He couldn't. He couldn't bear Christianity. But I mean, he knew enough to know that a lot of what he called Christianity is Christianity. But there's also the real thing, which he also admits at times. He always said, real Christians liked my work. But he didn't think there were many of them. And he's probably right.
He meant Caesar with the heart of Christ.
Did he mean that one?
Pardon?
He did mean that. His Jesus, though, is so strange, isn't it? It's Dostoevsky's fool. It's the innocent. Right? Paul is the figure of ressentiment. Jesus is Prince Mishkin, Alyosha. And then he wants that with the heart of, with Caesar. It's very, very puzzling.
Sometimes
Yeah?
I wonder.
Yeah.
I'm really not sure here.
But you've written on Nietzsche, yeah? Yeah.
You mentioned Dostoevsky, but where Dostoevsky in Bakhtin's reading
Yeah.
does such an extraordinary separation of author and narrator, and we can't
Yeah.
assume narrator is the voice of author. Sometimes I wonder if there is that in Nietzsche.
In Nietzsche, yeah.
And
Could be.
The voice, the narrative voice that is so against pity is different from the authorial voice that does know. There's a kind of compassion, but he feels humanity is so poised to misunderstand and mislead.
I think that must be it.
that he won't even
He's
articulate.
afraid to say. It's the same with how he's back and forth on Epicurus. On the one hand, he reads sometimes like Lucretius. On the other hand, he's saying, but the Epicureans are too weary. I'm tired of their weariness.
Yeah.
Pull yourself together. Get on with it.
No, I'm in an uncomfortable position because I love listening to David so much, but I feel it's my role here to protect him and to end things now. So
His compassion.
Sebastian-
Right.